A great many of you have emailed me or messaged me to talk about this very tragic case, resulting in the imprisonment of Oriel Gray for 3 years for manslaughter after the tragic and untimely death of retired midwife Celia Ward. For those of you that are not familiar with the case, Oriel Gray was walking on the same pathway that Celia Ward was cycling on in opposite directions. Oriel Gray gestured aggressively towards Mrs. Ward and said, and I quote, "Get off the effing pavement," after which Mrs. Ward sadly lost her balance, tumbled into the road and was killed. This has raised several points of debate, including the use of the pathway and whether or not it was a shared pathway and cycleway, the behaviour and actions of Oriel Gray and whether they really amount to manslaughter, and of course more generally the interaction between pedestrians and cyclists. Starting at the beginning, of course, with the pathway itself, there's much debate as to whether it is a shared cycleway or not and whether that makes any difference. The Highways Act of 1835, of course, makes it illegal to cycle on the pavement, itself attracting a fine of up to £500. In this particular case, it's reported that officers on the scene couldn't determine whether or not this was a pavement to be shared as a cycleway. This point was reiterated at trial, i.e. the police could not categorically state whether or not the pavement was a shared cycleway, a confusion supported by Cambridgeshire County Council, reiterating that and saying that they would review the location. But within the sentencing marks, however, the judge referred to it as a shared cycleway. And in fact, when reviewing the location myself with Google Maps, I was able to find a sign which indicates that it is shared by pedestrians and cyclists, this sign being located at the pedestrian crossing. But either way you look at it, there is understandable confusion, perhaps on both parts, as to whether or not this is or is not a shared cycleway. But there is also a question as to whether or not that should make a difference. Because you may remember in previous videos, I've talked about it being dangerous for a very young child to be cycling in the road. The law says cyclists should be in the road unless it is a shared cycle path or a designated cycle path. But one may ask the question, philosophically perhaps, as to whether it should be safer for cyclists to be on a shared path or whether cyclists should be entirely committed to the road. Now, of course, certain areas blur those lines, and this, I suggest, may be one of those areas. Whilst I was able to find at least one of these signs, it may not be obvious to everybody that's using those pathways. However, I might respectfully suggest that that's not the end of the matter. And regardless whether there is a definitive determination as to whether this is a shared cycle path or not, the actions of the pedestrian were found to be unlawful by the court. This, of course, being a very tragic example of what I've said in many different videos, where road users, that includes pedestrians, cyclists, drivers, lorry drivers, motorcyclists, horse riders, and anyone else for that matter that is using the road, should be using the roads, which includes the footpaths and cycle paths, with courtesy and respect to each other. And sadly, it's situations like this that demonstrate just how tragic a bad interaction can result. Possibly one of the neatest summaries of all of these issues within the news reports are the comments of Detective Sergeant Mark Dollard, who described the case as difficult and tragic and is quoted to summarise as follows. He says, "Everyone will have their own views on cyclists, pavements and cycleways, but what is clear is Oriel Gray's response to the presence of Celia on a pedal cycle was totally disproportionate and ultimately found to be unlawful, resulting in Celia's untimely and needless death." Miranda Moore KC, who was representing Gray, said, "What happened took but a moment but has impacted on many." She said that Gray's views was that cyclists should cycle on the road where pavements are narrow, and added that there'd been no intention to cause harm, nor was there any obvious risk of harm. But it's this final point that will allow me to reiterate what I've said in many other videos, in that there may very often not be an obvious risk of harm as a result of your actions or inactions. And it's this point that makes situations like this so very dangerous, and as this case has demonstrated, potentially fatal. Prosecuting the case, Simon Spence KC said that the defendant was angered by the presence of a cyclist on the footpath and gestured towards the cyclist, who then fell into the path of a moving car. This case will of course have had a significant impact upon the driver as well, who the jury was told had no chance to stop or to take any avoiding action. One of the main reasons I talk about road safety and attitude towards other road users so much on this channel is the number of injuries and fatalities caused between road users. For example, there are 2 cyclists on average each week killed in road accidents, and a further 84 or more are seriously injured. And whilst there is of course no perfect solution to resolving these dreadful statistics, we can at the very least begin by reducing the anger between road users, particularly against cyclists. Because for some reason, whenever cyclists come up in this conversation, there is always a slew of angry comments and opinions in the discussion thread. And while this case, as I understand it, is being appealed, at the moment it does say that if you are angry towards another cyclist and that causes them to fall and get injured or killed, then you may very well be held liable, even to the extent of manslaughter, as in this case here. So whilst I will hesitantly ask you to leave your thoughts and comments in the box below, I also ask you that you are respectful and polite and courteous to each other, even if you have differing opinions and views, of which doubtless there will be many. And please, of course, remember to subscribe to this channel if you're not already. And as always, I thank you for watching.